History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. When we look back at the year 2020, a year of pandemic, economic collapse, social upheaval, and political turmoil, it is tempting to view it as an anomaly, a black swan event, a sudden and unpredictable catastrophe. But what if it wasn't? What if 2020 was not the beginning of a crisis, but the violent culmination of trends that had been building for decades? What if the pandemic was not the cause of the chaos, but merely the catalyst that ignited a world already saturated with fuel? To understand the firestorm of 2020, we must first look at the dry tinder that had been accumulating for years, hidden in plain sight within the very architecture of our global system. Our story begins not in a wet market in Wuhan, but in the gleaming towers of Wall Street in the autumn of 2008. The global financial crisis was more than just an economic downturn. It was a near-death experience for the entire Western financial system. The intricate web of derivatives, subprime mortgages, and reckless leverage had brought the world to the brink. In response, the world's central banks, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, deployed a weapon of unprecedented scale: quantitative easing, or QE. In simple terms, they began printing money. Trillions of dollars, euros, and yen were created out of thin air and injected into the financial system to buy up government bonds and toxic assets, effectively bailing out the very institutions that had caused the crisis. This was sold to the public as a temporary emergency measure, but the emergency never truly ended. The global economy became addicted to this flow of cheap money. For the next 12 years, interest rates were held at or near zero. This had profound and deeply distorting effects. This vast ocean of liquidity did not primarily flow into the real economy to build factories or raise wages. Instead, it flowed into financial assets. Stock markets soared to record highs, disconnected from the sluggish growth of the real economy. Real estate prices in major cities skyrocketed, pushing homeownership out of reach for a generation. The wealthy, who owned the majority of these assets, saw their fortunes multiply at an astonishing rate. Meanwhile, the middle and working classes saw their wages stagnate and their purchasing power decline. A chasm of inequality wider than any seen since the Gilded Age was carved through society. This era of cheap money also created a legion of what are known as zombie companies. These were businesses that were not profitable enough to survive on their own merits, but were kept alive by their ability to constantly refinance their debt at near-zero interest rates. The entire corporate world was encouraged to take on massive amounts of debt. The system became incredibly fragile, leveraged to the hilt, and utterly dependent on the perpetual flow of central bank stimulus. It was a magnificent house of cards, shimmering in the sun, but a single gust of wind could bring it all down. This was the economic tinderbox. While this financial fragility was deepening, tectonic plates were shifting in the geopolitical landscape. The post-Cold War era, often described as the unipolar moment of American dominance, was definitively ending. For decades, the world had operated on a single operating system, one defined by American military power, the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and a set of Western-led institutions like the IMF and World Bank. This system, often called globalization, was predicated on the free flow of capital, goods, and, to a lesser extent, people across borders. But a new pole of power was rising with astonishing speed: China. Its economic miracle was unlike any in human history. It had lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, but it had done so without adopting Western liberal democracy. It presented a potent alternative model: state-led capitalism, long-term strategic planning, and technological prowess, all under the firm control of a single party. By the 2010s, China was no longer just the world's factory, it was a technological and geopolitical competitor. Initiatives like the Belt and Road were actively building a new network of trade and influence centered on Beijing. The launch of Made in China 2025 was a direct challenge to Western technological supremacy in fields like AI, robotics, and telecommunications. The United States, seeing its hegemonic position challenged, began to react. The pivot from cooperation to confrontation was stark. A trade war was launched, tariffs were imposed, and a technological Cold War began to simmer, with companies like Huawei and its 5G technology becoming a central battlefield. The consensus that had underpinned globalization for 30 years shattered. Nations began to look inward. The language of free trade was replaced by national security, reshoring, and decoupling. The intricate, hyper-efficient global supply chains that delivered our phones, our cars, and our medicines were now seen not as a strength, but as a critical vulnerability. The world was fracturing. Trust between great powers evaporated, replaced by suspicion and rivalry. This was the geopolitical tinderbox. At the same time, a third revolution was transforming the very fabric of society: the information revolution. The smartphone, social media, and the algorithmic feed had rewired how we communicate, how we think, and how we perceive reality. The old gatekeepers of information, established newspapers, television networks, academic institutions, saw their authority crumble. In their place rose the centralized, chaotic, and emotionally charged information ecosystem. Algorithms designed for one purpose, to maximize engagement, discovered that the best way to keep users glued to their screens was to feed them content that was outrageous, polarizing, and emotionally validating. This created filter bubbles and echo chambers, digital worlds where your own beliefs were constantly reinforced and opposing views were caricatured or demonized. Nuance died. Empathy for the other side withered. This digital environment proved to be the perfect petri dish for misinformation, conspiracy theories, and populist movements that thrived on a narrative of us versus them. The people versus the elite. Events like Brexit and the 2016 U.S. presidential election were not causes, but symptoms of this deeper societal fragmentation. They revealed populations deeply divided, living in separate informational realities, and harboring a profound distrust for established institutions. From the government to the media to science itself, society was becoming a collection of warring digital tribes, losing the shared sense of reality necessary for a democracy to function. This was the social tinderbox. And so, we arrive at the dawn of 2020. Imagine the scene: a global economy that looks prosperous on the surface but is in reality a debt-fueled zombie, utterly dependent on 0% interest rates. A geopolitical order that is fragmenting, with the two most powerful nations on Earth locked in a struggle for dominance, viewing each other with deep hostility. A global society that is polarized, angry, and swimming in a sea of algorithmically amplified misinformation, unable to agree on basic facts. Into this perfectly prepared tinderbox, a single spark fell: a novel coronavirus. The pandemic did not create these conditions. It simply exposed and accelerated them with brutal force. The virus was a biological event, but its consequences were shaped entirely by the pre-existing fragility of our systems. Consider the economic impact. The lockdowns, a necessary public health measure, were the gust of wind that hit the house of cards. Global commerce ground to a halt. The zombie companies that had been surviving on cheap debt suddenly had no revenue. The threat was not just a recession, but a complete systemic collapse, a repeat of 2008, but on a scale many times larger. And what was the response? The only tool the central banks had left: quantitative easing. But this time, it was QE on an infinite scale. The Federal Reserve and other central banks unleashed a torrent of liquidity that dwarfed the 2008 bailout. They didn't just buy government bonds. They began buying corporate debt, effectively backstopping the entire corporate world. Governments, no longer constrained by fears of debt, sent trillions of dollars in stimulus checks and loans directly to people and businesses. The temporary emergency measure of 2008 had now become the permanent foundation of the entire economy. The addiction was now absolute. Consider the geopolitical impact. The hyper-efficient, just-in-time global supply chains shattered overnight. Suddenly, nations realized they couldn't get face masks, ventilators, or pharmaceutical ingredients because the factories were all on the other side of the world. In a rival nation, the call to decouple and reshore became a deafening roar. Instead of global cooperation to fight a common enemy, we saw blame games, hoarding of supplies, and vaccine nationalism. The pandemic became another arena for the US-China rivalry, with each side pushing conspiracy theories about the origin of the virus, further eroding any chance of a unified global response. The fracturing of the world order went into overdrive. And consider the social impact. Lockdowns forced billions of people online, dramatically accelerating our transition into a digital existence. Work, school, shopping, and socializing all moved onto platforms controlled by a handful of tech giants. The information war reached a fever pitch. The same algorithmic mechanisms that had polarized politics were now applied to a life-or-death public health crisis. Misinformation about masks, treatments, and the nature of the virus itself spread like wildfire, hampering public health efforts and costing lives. The distrust in institutions that had been simmering for years boiled over into open rebellion against lockdowns, mask mandates, and eventually vaccines. The pandemic also laid bare the brutal inequality created by the post-2008 economy. While white-collar workers logged on from the comfort of their homes and watched their stock portfolios recover and grow, essential workers, often lower paid, and from minority communities, were forced to risk their lives on the front lines. This tension, combined with a series of high-profile police brutality incidents, erupted into the largest social justice protests in a generation. The streets of American cities and cities around the world became a theater for the rage and frustration that had been building for years. 2020 was not a coincidence. It was a convergence. It was the moment when the chickens of the 2008 financial crisis, the end of the unipolar world order, and the rise of the algorithmic society all came home to roost at the exact same time. The pandemic was simply the great revealer, the stress test that our globalized system failed in spectacular fashion. It stripped away the veneer of stability and showed us the rotten foundations underneath. The events of that year were not an end. They were an inflection point, the end of the post-Cold War era and the chaotic beginning of whatever comes next. The forces unleashed in 2020, the normalization of infinite money printing, the acceleration of deglobalization and great power conflict, and the deepening of social and informational fragmentation are still with us. They are shaping our present and defining our future. The world before 2020 is gone, and it is not coming back. We are now living in the world that 2020 created, a world where the unresolved crises of the past are no longer hidden, but are the overt, defining challenges of our time. The patterns were there all along for anyone willing to look. The question now is, what pattern will emerge from the chaos?